So, do you ever feel like you need protective gear when you walk into an IEP or ARD meeting? Because you just know it's probably going to be like another time where you're banging your head against the wall. Well, we have a great discussion with us, or topic of discussion with us today. We are going to be talking about alternative dispute resolution options. And if you are familiar with going to lots of IEP meetings and having disagreements, and knowing that just going to another IEP meeting isn't going to resolve the situation, I want you to stay tuned because we have a wonderful guest with us today. Let me bring Sarah on. We have Sarah Davis from the Washington, D.C. metro area. And Sarah is a parent of 5 children with different varying disabilities. She is a military spouse, so she knows what it's like to have to be moving all the time. And she also is this wonderful, extraordinary advocate that not only works with parents, but also tries to help break down all those barriers that we see in our culture, in our society, especially in our schools. So welcome, Sarah. I'm so glad that you could join us today. And is there anything else that you would like to add to your introduction so people get to know you?
Yeah, well, I'm so grateful to have the chance to be with you today. Yes, my name is Sarah Davis. I have 5 children with a range of disabilities, and I myself am also a person with a disability. So we have a lot in our family to be grateful for, and a lot of work to be done around advocacy in our community and in our country.
Yes. Well, we're going to be talking, like I said, about dispute resolutions today. So one of the things that I wanted us to talk about first was just some of the different types of options that are available for parents when going to IEP meeting after IEP meeting doesn't seem to, yield any kind of positive results. So if you want to talk about what some of the options are for parents.
Yeah, of course. So participating in the IEP process about 11 years now. And so during that period of time, we have moved around the country. My oldest daughter with an IEP, Lily, has attended, I think, 5 different schools at this point with IEPs. And so we have had challenges in some of the schools, and we've had great experiences in others. But really, what dispute resolution as a family, if you're not getting to the outcomes that you need to get to for your child, depends on the circumstances. So if you do have a child with an IEP, there are some federal options available, or federally outlined options available, I should say. They are administered either at the local level with some like informal options, going to your superintendent, so to speak, more informal. But then there's also a real outlined process where you can make a complaint to the state, and the state can look into the particular situation that you are concerned about to see if all of the procedures and processes that are required to be in place for a child with an IEP are being met adequately. Another option, also overseen by your state education agency, is due process. Due process is basically the first step in a court proceeding. Typically, there are attorneys, and depending on the state, there are different rules and regulations that govern evidence and behavior in the courtroom and all of those kinds of things. So that will depend on your state. But both the state complaint and the due process are available to every a family who has a child with an IEP or thinks that their child should have an IEP but has not been given one. You can also then access those dispute resolution options. And they are free of charge from the state for the family. And in reality, they are not free of charge because, again, you will have to pay for an attorney, most likely, if you hope to be successful at a due process hearing. And that will come at at your own cost. However, if you are successful in due process, there is a fee shifting provision such that if you win the case, potentially the school system could have to reimburse you for attorney's fees associated with that case. So those are kind of really the more formal options. There are also a variety of informal options. Some states have a complaint process that's separate from the IDEA that you can access. Maryland just started one of those through the Office of the Governor. There are dispute resolution processes through the licensing of different professionals that might work with your children. So if you have a speech language pathologist and your concern is really related to ethics or the way that the speech language pathologist is providing or not providing services, you potentially have a dispute resolution option through the licensing board. The same for school psychologists. The same even for attorneys who might be representing the school system. They have a whole host of ethical requirements that they're obligated to follow. And if they are not doing so, if they're lying to you or misrepresenting information, potentially you would have a dispute resolution option through the bar association that's licensing them as attorneys. So there are a host of options. If you are the parent of a child who has a 504 plan, or depending on the nature of the complaint, if you have a child with an IEP, but it falls under more of a Americans with Disabilities Act or Section 504 type of concern, like say, for example, your child is not being included in physical education because of their disability. That would be more of an access issue, could potentially fall under the 504 category. And then you would have a dispute resolution option of the Office of Civil Rights, and that's mandated through the federal government. Every state has a region that they can submit complaints to. One thing to know about the Office of Civil Rights complaints, or a couple things to know, is that it's a very short timeline. You only have 180 days from the day that the incident occurred to file the complaint. If you exceed that, most of the time, you're going to have surpassed the statute of limitations, and there won't be an option for you anymore to make that complaint. The other challenge at this point in time is the Office of Civil Rights has downsized, is my understanding, but the ability for them to process complaints has become very, very slow. And so even though you only have 180 days to file, they have as long as they take to process the complaint and get you an outcome. We filed a complaint in 2016 for my daughter because the school system denied her large print. She has a visual impairment. And it took more than 2 years, I believe, before we got a decision, which was towards the end of 2018. So all of the dispute resolution processes are there. Unfortunately, all of them have challenges with being effective.
Well, and that's the thing. And I know the other thing is, like, some states will have facilitated IEP meetings that you can request a facilitator. You can look at mediation. But yeah, I think, like you said, all of them seem to have some kind of shortcoming. But I think the other thing that is interesting is to look at what are the success rates as far as using these processes. And then, when you look at how often does a parent prevail in a due process hearing or in a state complaint. So do you want to talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, I think that's a really important piece. So as parents, and I'm also an advocate, one of the things to consider is always that cost benefit analysis. How much time is it going to take me to file this complaint? What type of impact might that have on the relationships that I have with the staff at the school, and how will that enhance or damage that relationship, and subsequently then the experience that my child has at that school? And what are the chances that if I put in all of this effort and take these risks, I will get the outcome that is helpful to my child? And I have to say, I think it really depends on the state that you're living in and how robust the system is in each of those states. Because again, mediation, state complaint, due process are all administered by the state education agency. And while there are federal guidelines around them having these programs, how exactly they're implemented is often left to the states. So in Maryland, we have a pretty abysmal success rate when it comes to due process. At this point in time, parents are losing more than 90% of the time.
Wow.
So that puts a lot of stress on families to come up with exorbitant legal fees. If you would like to take a case to due process, you are looking at conservatively 30 to 50,000 to be able to have for attorney's fees, for expert witness fees. And when you know in our state that you're going to lose at a greater than 90% chance, it really does put a pause in whether or not that's the dispute resolution that you want to pursue. I think it should be noted that families who file for due process do have the opportunity to participate in a resolution meeting. And at times, depending on the state and depending on the school system itself, you can be very successful in the resolution meeting, which can avoid some of the really expensive attorney's fees that could happen in due process. So that's kind of like the backside of due process. So even though our success rate for due process is very, very low, we do have families who are much more successful at the settlement or at the resolution meeting phase of due process. With state complaints in Maryland, we're a little more successful. We are probably around 50 or 60% successful as far as the state finding a violation has occurred. The challenge is in the state of Maryland, our state is very hesitant. They do on occasion, but very rarely stipulate the compensatory education or what the harm has happened and what the remedy needs to be. Typically, our state is saying, okay, hey, we found a violation. Now, IEP team and the same IEP team that committed the violation, you decide if there was harm, and if so, what to do about it. And so you can imagine, much as if a cop pulled me over and said, by the way, I think you were speeding. Can you decide whether indeed you were and how much you'd like to pay in a fine? There's a conflict of interest with the IEP team really prioritizing the needs of the student in the resolution aspect of a state complaint. So we find that while parents can potentially be more successful in finding of the violation, they won't necessarily get the outcome that they're looking for, because in addition to not stipulating for the most part what the remedy will be, oftentimes there's not enough accountability around whether a remedy was implemented effectively. So we just have breakdowns all along the way in the process here in Maryland.
Yeah, and I wanted to say hi to Heather. She's watching in from Seattle. So, hey, Heather. And I know what you were talking about in Maryland, Sarah, is what I also found in Colorado, is that so many times the parent will, the state complaint officer will rule that there have been violations. And then the recommendation is go back to the IEP team. If if the parent requested compensatory education, the complaint officer will say, have the IEP team decide what the compensatory ed will be. And it's like, well, I was just with that IEP team for how many meetings and we couldn't come to agreement. So it is so frustrating. There are a few states, I don't know, maybe around 7 or 8 now, that do list their complaints on the State Department of Ed website. More states don't, though. But if you can go to the Department of Ed website and see the state complaints and click on those and look at what the complaint was about, what the issue was, what the ruling was, you get a feel for what is the trend in your state. So that can be helpful for parents to look at too.
Yeah, and Maryland is one of the states that publishes their state complaint findings as well as their due process findings. And in fact, Maryland has state complaints going all the way back to 2011. And I'm actually at this point kind of reading through some of them and trying to analyze some of the data and trends from a more statistical perspective. But in fact, I think one of the tips for parents who are considering writing a state complaint is it would be very helpful to take the time to review some of those and try to find state complaints that are identifying similar or the same issue that you are experiencing. And then you can just copy and paste and lift some of that language right out of those state complaints that are similar to your circumstances, changing, of course, the specifics of the child's name and And that will give you a template to be able to file your own state complaint. I found that very, very useful for our family.
Yeah, I think that's a great tip, because especially if you can use the language that the state complaint officer said, like, this is a violation because, or whatever. So then you can use that language for your complaint. So yeah, it does save time, because I think the other thing is, even though it doesn't cost money to file a state complaint, you look at the amount of time and stress and emotional drain of continuing to, you know, engage in, disagreements with the district. So that can be, I think parents sometimes aren't prepared for the kind of the emotional drain of the impact of filing a complaint, going all the way through that story again, finding your evidence to support everything. I mean, it is a time consuming process. So you have to be, I think, aware of that at the beginning, that you're going to be spending some time doing this.
And I think what piece that was even harder to anticipate for me when I filed state complaints is the emotional toll, because we have a tendency, at least I do, I think most people do, to kind of bury information in your mind and move on. But as you're in the process of drafting a state complaint and you are having to read through all of the emails, all of the documentation, put it all in order, identify the legal violations that have occurred, it's very emotionally draining. It's disheartening, because at that point you've put all the pieces together. You know exactly what's gone wrong. You know that there is a lack of accountability and that your child's been failed. And so just be prepared that it requires a lot of cups of tea and a lot of hugs from your support system to get through that process. And depending on how big the issue is, it can take, you might need to put aside a lot of time to be able to do it. I've had state complaints that took me 20, 30 hours to write because of the quantity of data that I was looking through. So another recommendation is try to narrow your issues when you're writing a state complaint, and just focus in on those most important pieces. One, for your own emotional well-being, so you're not drudging through all the pain and difficulty that has been had along the way, but also for the state complaint officer, because what I have found is sometimes if you bring out every issue and put in every detail, they get lost in the story, and you may be less likely to get a favorable outcome just because of the quantity of information that's there. I think one of the important pieces to talk about for different dispute resolution options is timelines. So one of the nice things about state complaints, one, you have a whole year to go back. So at least in Maryland, I think it might be different in different states, so you'll have to check your particular rules. But in Maryland, we have a 1-year statute of limitations, and they only have 60 days to process the complaint and turn it around. So it's a pretty quick decision, quicker than any of the other formal dispute resolution options, with the exception of mediation, which can also be a very quick outcome. But due process, while you will go ahead and get into the courtroom fairly quickly for due process, if you are unhappy with the decision and you have to go to appeal, that starts a year's timeline. For example, we got taken to due process by our school system. They filed it in, I believe it was September of 2017. We went to court January of 2018. As most families in Maryland, we lost. We were in the 97th percentile who lose, or whatever that number is at this point in time. And now it's on appeal. We do not expect a decision from appeal until the end of this year. So you're talking 2 years from the time that it was filed to the time when the appeal decisions comes back. And that's only at the district court level. If this ends up being something that goes up to circuit court level, or in the very rare cases like Andrew F. goes up to the Supreme Court, you're looking at years and years and years for that process to be finished, by which time the finding might be completely irrelevant to your child who has continued forward in their education.
Oh, exactly. So I think that, that shows kind of some of the shortcomings, even though, you're given these procedural safeguard rights. There are so many shortcomings. One, we've talked a little bit about, is the expense of, hiring an advocate to help at the lower levels. When you get into due process, you really need an attorney that's experienced in special ed law. So there's the expense. We've talked about the emotional, turmoil and drain that is for us as parents. So look, can you go into a little bit more about what are some of the systemic shortcomings of the options that we currently have?
Yeah, I think I've touched a little bit on most of it. I think that the macro level takeaway for me is that our systems are in place because that's how they're designed to be. The powers that be have created these dispute resolution options in such a way that they favor the school system and the school system continuing in their decision making and in the way that they're implementing special education versus favoring change and favoring the parent. Um, if we look at the state education agency, we've talked about the state complaint process not necessarily providing a resolution with and sharp. I think I just lost your video. So I'm just going to continue and hopefully you'll come back in. But at the state level, when you talk about due process, that system is particularly broken with the quantity of expense that it takes. There you are again. With the quantity of expense, with the timeline if appeal is necessary, and with the success rate. So those are some of the systemic problems. But stepping back again, because of the difficulty in accessing a favorable outcome for parents with whichever of these dispute resolution options are accessed, it doesn't promote systemic change at the district level, at the school level, when these decisions come out. So for example, I mentioned earlier that we filed an Office of Civil Rights complaint for my daughter with a visual impairment, and we got a favorable response. However, what it very much like the state education agency had us go back to the same school system and determine what harm there was and then what remedy. So the school system predictably determined there was no harm. The fact that my daughter had gone to the nurse 37 times in one school year, that we had paid thousands of dollars for vision therapy and for advocates and for the doctor to attend, none of that was considered by the school system to merit harm. And the school system then decided that there was no compensation whatsoever. So we've got no remedy at all from that complaint process. Then the other systemic remedy that was mandated by the Office of Civil Rights was that a letter needed to be written to the school itself, reminding them that they needed to provide for effective communication, which is one of the pieces of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and to give primary consideration to the wishes of the student and the parent regarding what accommodations a person with a disability might need. They didn't even do that. They came back with a letter that says, by the way, we just want to remind you that you need to implement the 504 plan. This was not even on the 504 plan. That did not address what the challenge was. And you know what? A week later, I get a call from a parent at the same school that child is being denied large print. So nothing of any systemic nature whatsoever happened from the complaint. Nothing for my family happened from the complaint. And yet we spent I thousands of dollars in the process trying to advocate for my daughter, and I spent many hours drafting that complaint. So,
And that's the thing that can be so frustrating. And Heather has a question here. She says, if you win a due process, how is the school district held responsible to make sure they follow through?
So, I'm not an expert at due process. I'm not an attorney, but from what I've read and what I've spoken with other families, it depends on the specific state that you're in and the process for that state. But primarily, a court order is created mandating a certain outcome. And if that outcome is not implemented, oftentimes the parent has to refile due process to go try to get them to implement the finding from the last due process. So again, you're talking about more expense and more emotional burden. And perhaps there are other processes that are in place in other places, but that's what I have heard.
Well, and even with state complaints, I think, if there's findings and recommend, or some kind of recommendation for resolution, and the school district doesn't implement what the state complaint officer found, is that then your next step is to go to due process to get that enforced. So it's just, I think maybe the intent was good there with IDEA, but it really isn't working. And the other thing I think that you mentioned that's important for parents is to look at other laws besides IDEA. You can look at the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Section 504 of the Rehab Act. So sometimes by using other laws, you can, have something a stronger case, get something enforced, but it still takes such persistence on the parent part. It's not like this is going to be done as soon as you send this complaint off. Like, you can feel assured that the right thing is going to happen, that justice is going to prevail. And so that's the part that's so discouraging. And I know that you have been working in a number of arenas, both federal and state level. So if you want to talk a little bit about, I don't know, I guess some of the next steps that parents can take, or what can we do to change the systemic problems?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things is as you're pointing out, enforcement of the IDEA and our children's rights really kind of rests on our shoulders, and we are the David in the David and Goliath relationship. We don't
And I'm not hearing you. I think you froze a bit, and now I'm not hearing you. So I don't hear you. Oops, I lost you. So Sarah will be back with us momentarily. If you have had experience doing, using dispute resolution processes, it would be great for you to type that in the comments. And Sarah, I think, is coming back. Here she is. So sometimes it's just the internet speed and, the tech gods. But I think you want to say something, Sarah?
Yeah, so I was saying about what we can do as next steps. So first and foremost, remember as a parent that this is a marathon and it's not a race. Make sure that you have a support system around you, whether that be your church, whether that be Facebook groups with other parents who understand and who are walking the walk. But you need your people around you, because it's a difficult journey. And then as far as working to make change, we need different processes in place that really put the responsibility for enforcement of the IDEA, which has a lot of great language, great intention, but is not being implemented in the way that would properly support our children. We need to put that back on the shoulders of our state education agency and our local education agency. Our shoulders as parents are not broad enough to carry the burden of enforcement, and that's really what is happening at this point. So I would encourage all parents to find out who the voices in your community and in your state are. Every state has them. Sometimes Facebook or social media can be a great way to connect and find out who is speaking up. But every year in every state, there is legislation that is proposed around special education, around people with disabilities, that would strengthen rights. For example, in the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., which is right next door, they just had legislation passed recently that gives parents the right to observe their child in the classroom if you have a child with a disability, and the right for the parents expert, like the psychologist working with your child, to also be able to go and observe the child in the classroom. That is not a right that we as a nation hold. But in DC, clearly parents got together and organizations got together and they wrote legislation that made sure that parents get this right. And so we need to have this kind of legislation happening all over the country. A really important one is consent. In some states, parents have the right to consent to changes made to an IEP plan. We've lived in states that had consent. It changes the entire dynamic of the IEP meeting when the school system knows that if they try to unilaterally make decisions without your agreement as a parent, that they are the ones that will have to take you to court instead of you having to take them to court. So these kinds of local legislation make a tremendous difference in the lives of children with disabilities. So that's what needs to happen locally. And then we need national legislation to come through and strengthen the rights and the accountability around the IDEA. I have not heard that the IDEA is coming up for reauthorization or rewriting anytime soon. I think at the moment with our political climate, that's probably best. But I really think that locally focusing on state legislation is where we as a community of people with disabilities can begin to make some greater progress. Another success that happened not too long ago is ABA therapies. Autism Speaks and some of the other autism organizations have been very successful with getting insurance to be required to cover ABA therapy. And I believe that that is almost state. So there's a lot of progress that we can make, and every voice counts. Please know that as a parent, if you want to take the experiences that you have had fighting for your individual child and turn it into something more than sadness and heartache, you have to go that extra mile, and you have to take the time to connect in, to tell your stories to the legislators, and to do the hard, have the impact on your child, change it for your child, but begin to change it for our coming generations.
Oh, exactly. And I want to put in a plug for the last Thursday of the month. Courtney Hanson, who said hi a few minutes ago from Washington, the state of Washington, is going to be our guest the last Thursday of the month. And she's going to be talking specifically about working with your legislators. So, I think this is one of those topics that we need to kind of, I don't know, attack, if that's the right word, but we need to come from, a legal aspect. We need to get involved in politics. We need to come from, like you said, sharing your stories to touch the emotional level and for people to understand that. So there's so many areas, and not every parent is going to feel comfortable in all of those arenas. But if you can work with a group of families, and identify what your strength is, what kind of avenue you want to work towards, that's going to be really helpful, because we do need more voices. And I think the other thing that I'm pretty passionate about is looking at systemic change for education in general, because I think when we keep ourselves in this special ed silo, that we do ourselves and our kids a disservice, that we need to embrace other families that have students that have been marginalized, like, whose English is a second language, who,
Yes.
Are from single families, transgender students. I mean, there's so many students that are marginalized in our schools. So if we can widen our circle of allies and look at this as a change for the whole district, a change for the state, how it's going to benefit all students. This, I think, is going to help each of our kids win that kind of education that they deserve.
Yes, I completely agree. And I think that we're seeing that more in civil rights as a broader view, because I think people are starting to realize that all of us are saying the same thing. We are all saying that all of us need access to opportunity. All of us need access to resources. All of us have a contribution to give and need to be celebrated for the unique things we bring to the table. And it's not just one community or another community, it's all of us working together, and by broadening to include other civil rights organizations and focuses, we have more voices at the table. So for example, I am a lifetime member of my local chapter of the NAACP, because again, they are a civil rights organization that has multiple focuses. And what we find professionally, and probably anecdotally, people who are watching, is when different types of marginalizing experiences overlap, those students experience the most difficult academic experiences. So, if it's if the student is a student with a disability and a English language speaker or an English language learner, you're going to find that student has more challenges accessing, you know, a high quality education than somebody who was just a student with a disability or just a English language learner. So again, we as a community need to be welcoming to all of the different types of challenges and marginalized voices that are there, and broaden our scope so we become a voice to be reckoned with. So.
Oh, exactly. And Heather also said when we were talking about trying to get, you know, complaints and everything actually implemented as far as the resolution, she said, wow, something has to change. None of these schools are held responsible, and so much time is being wasted on the help the child so desperately needs. Thanks for answering. And thanks, Heather, for being here. And I think, you know, that's the thing. It's so Sarah is an advocate, and so I also wanted to show Sarah your email if people wanted to contact you, so they have that information. And then Sarah, do you also want to talk a little bit about your Facebook page where they could also reach out to you?
Yeah, so a couple of years ago, myself and some other parents started a Facebook page. It's titled Parent Advocacy Consortium. The goal of the page is to connect parents together and to help facilitate advocacy at a systemic level, whether it be systemically within your local school system, systemically at the state level. You know, at some point, perhaps we'll have a federal voice. At this point, we're rather an informal group, but you know, that would be a wonderful thing. But it's a great group. You're welcome to join. It's a publicly open group, so everybody is welcome. I'm sorry, excuse me 1 second. Multitasking here. And we welcome questions. There are a lot of really great folks who actively participate on the page, advocates. I think we even have perhaps some attorneys who are kind of viewing some of the content there, and lots of very well-informed parents. So if you have a question, if you have a concern, please don't hesitate to post. And we also just provide community. Sometimes there are no good answers.
Oh, for sure. The other resource that I found helpful when I'm working with families is Cadre. And this is an organization that is located in Eugene, Oregon, but they serve the whole country. They are funded by the Federal Department of Education. And if you go to Cadre's website, you can see lots of different resources there about the topics that we've been talking about today. So that can be really helpful too. And I think, you know, I think what we're seeing is that this is happening in every state, right? And so trying to figure out the best way for us to become united. I think when you look at your school building, you want to make change there. And sometimes you have to go up to the district level in order to impact that change. So one of the other tips that I give to parents is to become more involved on typical district committees and task force. And sometimes that can be like a waste of time when you are just giving token parent input. However, I think it's important that we start at that grassroots level, and like I said, widen our circle. But the other thing is there are national organizations that are extremely involved with lobbying in Washington, D.C. and on the state level. So membership in national organizations can be another way that you support making change. And it's just, you know, it's a matter of, I think, all of us continuing to march on, because it's not going to happen without our voice. If you look at the history of special education, and when our kids first even got invited to walk into a public school, it was because of the parent movement. So that will continue, I think, to be the biggest way that we make change. And it's just incredibly important for all of us to support each other and share resources. When you have a good ruling on a state complaint, to share that with others. When you have a strategy that has worked for you when you're at an IEP meeting, to share that with other parents. So that's why I think the value of Facebook groups, and I know my page here, the Visions and Voices Together, we try to do that with our weekly Facebook Lives, but also throughout the week of just posting information and helping parents find resources. The other resource that I wanted to mention to parents is I do have a membership group. If you're interested in that, you can just put membership or something in the comments and I can get back with you. But if this show has had meaning and you have enjoyed learning from Sarah, I hope that you'll share the video. If you want the show notes where I compile the key takeaways from the show and I give you the timestamp of when that was talked about in the video, so it's easy to go back and reference, and some additional resources about dispute resolution, then if you type just the word show notes in the comments, my IEP bot will come back and get you signed up so you can get the show notes for today. Because Sarah has given us a wealth of information, and sometimes it's helpful to go back and I need to replay that video or I need to see that again. So I think that would be a helpful resource. The replay will be up here on the page as soon as our live is done. So you can always have your friends come back and share that with them. So I don't see any other live questions, Sarah, that you haven't answered already, but what would be maybe some concluding thoughts that you would like to share with our viewers?
Yeah, again, just really grateful to have this opportunity to talk and just to continue persevering. All change takes time. If we look at some of the other civil rights movements, they have all taken a long time. And we are the front runners to this civil rights movement. This is our time to be the voice and make the change. And to remember that it will take time and all of our work is not for naught. Every time you sit in an IEP meeting for your child and you remain diplomatic and you talk about what the child's needs are and you talk about your concerns with the lack of meeting those needs, we are helping to educate those particular team members. And maybe again, it won't have a substantial impact for our child, but maybe the next child that comes along, it will. I spoke to a school psychologist who had become a private psychologist, and she said, there was one meeting that I was at and the parent looked at me and said, you really can't understand until you have a child like mine. And that school psychologist went on to have a child with a disability and then left working with the schools and began to work privately. And she said, that comment always came back to me that I really just did not understand what this child needed and what this family was experiencing. And so remember that we are always ambassadors as well for our children and for our community, and for helping to raise awareness around what the needs are, how our children learn differently, and how they are to be equally valued as members of our society and have just as much to offer as anybody else. Sorry, excuse me.
That's the life of a busy advocate.
Yes.
The phone is ringing off the hook. They're trying to call you there.
And then they'll call my cell phone and then it'll kick me off the live.
I know. Well, I appreciate you carving out time to be with us because your insight and your wisdom and your experience is so critical that gets shared with others. So I'm so glad that we could have you on as a guest and provide this information to families and educators around the country. Next week, I'm going to be having Kathy Snow on as our guest. Kathy is the author of Disability is Natural. She is an international speaker, so she will have, I think, a really nice global aspect too of where we are with inclusive education, as far as looking at our students' strengths and building on those. And we also will be talking with Kathy about what we can do so this status quo that we're experiencing isn't maintained, but that we can really make systemic change. So I invite our viewers to tune in next Thursday at noon Mountain Time, and Kathy Snow will be our guest. So, Sarah, thank you again. And I hope that you will continue to prevail for the advocacy that you are engaged in, not only for your own families, or your family, but the families that you work with. So thank you again. And I will see everybody next Thursday. So thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.